Okay, so we're back here and we're starting with module 2. And to kind of start this off, we go back to this idea about stats, right? When we think about stats, we're interested in prediction. And so one aspect of this, right, is that we have like an outcome of interest. So one aspect of this that we kind of look for, right? So this could be any number of things, right? This could be, if we think about different outcomes, this would be like, goes back to prison. Or who gets shot by police. Or who will contract Ebola or something like that. So that's something that so those could be all different outcomes, right? And we use that by looking, trying to find explanatory variables. And so if we think back to our example, right? So like what predicts the outcome? So what can we use to figure out more? And so if we go back to prison, right, this could be who goes back to prison? It could be access to transportation. So differences in that could predict, right? Shot by police. That could be aggression in encounters. Who contracts Ebola? That could be people who travel to Africa or certain parts of Africa. Let's say West Africa, because I think that's where Ebola goes. And so what we're kind of looking for, right, is that we use these explanatory variables to explain variation in the outcome, right? And that's something that statistics can do for us. And so a basic way to do this is with a contingency table. So this gives us a few things, right? It's a form of association. And can establish a relationship. And so that can look a lot of different ways. And so let's talk a little bit about them because they're kind of important, right? Because, these are, we can look at crosstabs, which you should already know in your notes, and they allow us to find patterns. So let's start with like a basic one, right? So if we go back to our first example, let's go back to, so we look at people who go back to prison, go to Priz, and people who don't go. Label here. At the top, we'll put people who had transportation and no trans. No transp. So make our little basic table and let's fill this in with some made up data, right? So let's say that 75 people go back to prison, they get transportation, and don't go is 125, right? And so if we go back to people who had no transportation, And they go back to prison, right? Let's say that's 125, and who don't go, and they had no transportation whatsoever. Let's say that is 50 people, or I guess, oh, they keep things balanced, right? We'll say that's 75, right? Let me erase this, make it a little cleaner. So in this basic form of analysis, right, the first thing that we usually want to do is to sum all this up, right? So if we go back to our color, we see that this is 200 people, and there are 200 people here, right? And so it leaves that are 400 total. So in here, we know there are 200 people in this row, and there are 200 people in this row. So what do we ultimately find here? Like, what kind of information can we figure it out? So if we look at one, right, so we can first look at a conditional proportion. And this is in a single cell that we'll kind of abbreviate as a conditional proportion, right? So what does this tell us? 75 out of 200 people. What is that? 75 divided by 200 people. And so this tells us in this first one, like right here, that 37.5% who go back to prison if they have access to transportation. But we can also find in this cell, right, that there are 125 out of 200 people who 62.5% of the sample go and don't go, right? So we have here, right, so these basic conditional proportions, they give us like an initial idea in this column of a behavior. So we look at that, we think, wow, it's kind of big, right? And so if we look at, we also know that 37.5% of people who go to prison are right here, right? And had no transportation. So there are like 400 people total, right? So we add up like these two columns, right? So out of everyone, so about 50% of people though end up going to prison, right? So we also find that based off this proportion, right, if we look at a marginal proportion, and this is going to be at the row or column amount, we find that 50% of people return. So what kind of conclusion would we make based off of these data, right? Like what would we find in this, right? Well, if there's no sizable difference, right, and we find that only like 50% people return, that means the other 50% don't return, we might conclude that transportation doesn't impact likelihood going back to prison. But this could change and vary depending on what the data are and how we measure it, right? So this is sort of just like a sort of foundation. There's an example that I have in the notes that I think you should look at. It's a bit more detailed and it uses data that I used. I'd also encourage you to look at the examples that I have that are within the textbook as well for different stuff. But so we'll leave this as the first little introductory video, and I'll see you guys in the next